let's create a common enrollment system for all the schools, charter and traditional, and let's put everybody on a playing field.
Hi, I'm Andy Smarick, the Morgridge Fellow of Education Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I am thrilled to have David Osborne here as a guest to talk about his brand new book, great book, very important book, Reinventing America's Schools. David, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, before even getting into this book, let's talk about the book that maybe began these ideas, at least my understanding of them or introduction to them, 25 years ago now, Reinventing Government. What was that book all about?
Well, the book argued that we were in the process, we were in a transition, a long-term transition from the way we organize the public sector in the industrial era to the way we were going to organize it in the information age. And that if you looked particularly at local governments and to some degree at state governments, you could see the outlines of a kind of new paradigm emerging. And rather than large, centralized, hierarchical bureaucracies that were rule-driven and that were monopolies, which was the norm in the industrial era, we were evolving more decentralized systems, using competition for service delivery sometimes rather than monopoly. Focusing on results, measuring results, and trying to hold organizations accountable to deliver results, figuring out who the customers were, asking them what they wanted, and giving them choices. It was organized around 10 principles, and probably the most fundamental one was one we called Catalytic Government, which is probably not a great title for it. But
Catalytic Government, all right.
The idea that government's fundamental role is to steer. It's not to row. It can row, and it does, but what we really wanted to do is to steer, to deal with large issues and get others to deliver some of the services and solve some of the problems. So government should be a catalyst and a broker and a partner to get nonprofits and for-profits and community organizations and use many, many different methods from contracts to tax credits to vouchers to get services delivered and problems solved. So that was a very core idea, but there were 10 principles around which the book was organized.
Well, this rowing and steering is the one I think that certainly caught my attention when I first read the book, and probably caught the attention of a lot of other people. And if I understand it correctly, or at least the way that I describe it, is if a ship has to go from one place to another, you can be in the business of actually doing the backbreaking work of rowing, making sure that it moves. Or there's also a captain who makes sure that everything happens, but allows other people to do that work. And so essentially what your book was arguing, and now we can start talking about education, is if the government cares about schooling, which it should, does that mean that the government has to run all of the schools, or can the government just make sure that schools are being run and the kids have access to them? So can you talk a little bit about that? What is the difference between the government rowing and steering when it comes to education?
Well, you know, during the industrial era, we did all the rowing. It was all public schools with public employees, all part of centralized organizations. And it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, when it is that way, two things happen. One, the people who are steering are also rowing, and it's really hard to do both well. So you get really lousy steering. These districts don't do a good job of planning for the future, of figuring out, do we have the right mix of schools for our mix of students? You know, what should be changing? They just operate, and the schools just go on year after year. The second thing that happens is the people who are steering are usually elected, school boards, and appointed superintendents who work for them. Well, they've got, if in an urban school district, they got thousands of employees. Those employees all vote. And in school board elections, you know, not a whole lot of other people vote. Turnout's typically 10 or 15%. So you've got, essentially you become politically captive of your employees, because if you get too many of the adults in the system upset, let's say you close a failing school, the employees are unionized, the union organizes a protest, they all vote against you at the next election. That's one reason that school districts change so slowly, because the people steering have to be very careful not to alienate the people rowing. Now, if you have independent organizations operating schools, as in the charter sector, that changes entirely, because you might get one building upset by closing a school, but none of the others are going to be upset. In fact, they're going to be actually quite interested in getting that building for themselves, so they can teach those kids. So it's a fundamental principle in education, and there's so much protest against it. This is privatization, this is evil. People don't realize that in the 21st century, probably the majority of public services are delivered by private organizations. I mean, Obamacare, it's all private delivery. Medicare, Medicaid, all private delivery. Head Start, nonprofits deliver that. Our streets, our highways, our bridges, who builds them? Private companies. Private companies often maintain them. So education is actually behind. We're just beginning to catch up to the rest of the public sector.
That's right. So I'm going to want to dig in a second into the role of the government when they are doing the business of steering instead of rowing. But let's first actually explain what in the world is a charter school.
Yeah, good question, because half the population has no idea, according to the surveys. A charter school is a public school, but it is operated by an organization independent of a school district. Usually nonprofit organization, sometimes for-profit, but about 85% are nonprofit, and they're more effective. And it has a lot of autonomy. It gets to run its own show. In exchange for that, it's supposed to have a lot of accountability. And the charter is a performance contract, typically for 5 years, although it varies from state to state. But if the kids are falling too far behind, then the authorizer, the body that authorizes this charter, that gives the organization its charter, is able to take the charter away and close the school or replace it with another operator.
So one way that I thought about this back in the early days is that banks were chartered. The King of England, I believe, chartered some of our colonies.
Yes, he did.
It's a way that a government agency, someone with power, has a contract with some other group of people or some sort of entity to enable them to do something that the government believes is important. So in this case, the government thinks public education is important, so it charters nonprofits to run schools.
Yeah, we could use the word contract. The government uses contracts to get all kinds of things done. This is applying it to education.
That's right. And so the government holds one end of this contract and says what it wants to have accomplished, but it frees up some nonprofit organization to get the job done. Government is steering and the nonprofit's rowing.
Exactly.
So in the traditional model when a district runs schools, the idea is that a public school would be enrolled by residents. Kids were assigned to a school based on their home address. And the idea is that the school would exist in perpetuity. The school would be there forever. The problem in a lot of cases turned out, what happens if the school's really low performing for a long period of time? What the charter model can help out with is saying that the government expects certain things out of the nonprofit provider. And if the results are not good, then the government can say, sorry, we're revoking your charter, we're closing you down.
Exactly, exactly. And they can theoretically do that with district-operated schools. But it's so hard politically, because when you do, you put some of your employees out of work and you get a protest. They usually belong to a union, and you get a system-wide protest, and you, as the elected school board, may lose your next race because of this. So traditional school districts rarely close schools for performance. Sometimes they do it because they're out of money and they've got schools that are more than half empty and they want to consolidate, but rarely do they close their own schools with their own employees because they're not performing.
And so where do the kids go if, say in New Orleans, if a school is, now that 100% of kids or close to it are in charter schools, where do the kids go if the government decides that one of these charters just it's not getting good enough results? What happens to the kids?
Well, that's the beauty of these systems where you have a lot of charters. There's lots of operators, so they don't really close the school. They terminate the charter, and they find another operator to operate in that building with those kids. So you don't disrupt the families and the kids. You just get a better operator. And often they let the families have a say in which operator they choose.
Yeah, in a lot of cities, and unfortunately in some cities still today, it was the case where a neighborhood could have a low-performing school for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or longer. And if the families didn't have a lot of money to send their kids to a private school or move to a different neighborhood, those kids would go to that failing public school, and maybe their kids would go to that failing public school.
And half the kids would drop out.
That's right. And so what chartering hopefully promises is not only do the families have options, because there will be a range of charter schools, that the government will say no one has the right to run a failing school in perpetuity. If that school is not working, we're going to close it down or have someone else run that school and give the families other options. It's a way of thinking about this as double accountability. Parents get to choose their school, and the government can say if a school's not working out, we're going to actually replace it.
Exactly. And it's funny, you know, private companies have the same double accountability. They're accountable to their customers. They have to sell to their customers, and their customers can take the money elsewhere. They're also accountable to their owners, the stockholders.
That's right.
So, you know, in this case, the citizens are the owners.
So many of us grew up when we went to public schools. We just took for granted that there would be what some people call an exclusive territorial franchise or government monopoly. We went to a public school. It was run by the government, the local school district. Full stop. That was public education.
And we didn't have a choice, that we were assigned to that school.
Schools were enrolled based on your home address. That's just the way it was. But in this new model, the government shifts and says other people can run schools or other entities. Who are those other entities?
Well, most of these schools are charter schools, although increasingly we have schools that are like charter schools and are called Renaissance schools or innovation schools or partnership schools. But let's talk about charters. Basically, most charters are run by nonprofit organizations. I think it's around 85% of them. The rest are run by for-profit organizations. And in truth, the nonprofits have performed a lot better, and the for-profits have given charters a bad name in a lot of places because there have been scandals and problems. But they are organizations that decide we want to operate a school. They have a board.
A nonprofit board?
Right, exactly. And they employ the teachers and the other staff.
So instead of, if I have this right, the government saying we want public education to be done, therefore we have to run all schools, the government says we want to make sure kids are well educated, so we are going to delegate the responsibility of running schools to a wide array of nonprofit operators. So then what does the government actually do? What's their responsibility?
Oh, they have so many. In a word, their responsibility is to steer. What does that mean? That means picking organizations to operate schools that all signs say they can do a good job. Measuring their performance, holding them accountable. If after a certain number of years, and for the typical charter it's 4 or 5 years, the children are falling behind grade level rather than catching up, their job is to replace that school with a better operator. They also have to figure out, do we have the right mix of schools? You know, we have this Montessori school over here, and there's huge demand for it. There's a big waiting list. Let's get another one and another one. We have a STEM high school, big demand. We have this school over here that's half empty, not a lot of demand. So adjusting supply to demand and to need. And then, of course, dealing with all of the equity issues that come up. Because when people have choices, sometimes inequities develop. So for example, in a big school district, let's say in Denver, they don't provide transportation. They provide transportation for the district-operated schools, but not for the charters. So let's say you're a poor parent. You don't have a car. You work 2 jobs. Your kid does not have equal opportunity to go to high-quality schools because you can't drive them. So that has to be addressed. In New Orleans, they decided we're going to require every school, and by the way, next year there will be 100% charters in New Orleans. Every school is going to have to provide transportation. Then there's the question of the enrollment system. Is there equity there? Do all families have equal access? Or do families that have more time, more education, speak better English, have a leg up? Are moms baking brownies for principals and getting their kids into the best schools? Well, that happens everywhere.
Right.
So let's create what New Orleans, Denver, Washington, D.C., Newark, and next year Indianapolis have done is let's create a common enrollment system for all the schools, charter and traditional, and let's put everybody on a playing field. Every family lists their top choices, and then a computer algorithm matches. And if you're not happy, you go to a second round and try again. But it eliminates, you can't bake brownies for the principal and get your kid into the school.
Right.
So I could go on. There's special ed. There's issues of discipline. You know, we have 2 schools that are expelling a lot of kids. Let's look at that. Let's try to figure out how to, you know, and then we've got schools that are suspending a ton of kids, and so they're out of school. You're not learning when you're out of school. Well, you know, do we need a policy, or do we need, different cities deal with this differently. In Washington, D.C., the charter board said, we're just going to publicize your rates of suspension and expulsion. And just by putting attention on it and getting the media to put attention on it, they got the schools to deal with it and try to change the way they did discipline a little bit. So my point is there's always issues that somebody who's steering has to address. Otherwise, they go unaddressed, and you get problems and you get unequal opportunity for children.
Well, this is the overarching point that I think a lot of people would be curious about, because in concept we say we're going to let nonprofits run schools and have the government play a role, but what you just listed is everything from transportation to enrollment to equity to school performance to making sure there's a diverse array of options. It's not like the government disappears, the government just slots into a different role.
It's a big job, and way back in Reinventing Government, you know, what Ted Gabler and I argued was we may be talking about a smaller government in terms of the number of employees, but we're talking about a stronger government. Because when, for example, when a school board and superintendent don't have to operate schools, then they have the time and energy to do a good job of the steering. And that's what we've seen in the real world. I mean, in New Orleans, when the Recovery School District, which was the authorizer for, 60 charter schools, for a while they operated schools. When they got out of that business, they suddenly started to address all of these system issues. And over a period of about 5 years, they solved about 5 big ones, including the enrollment issue, the discipline issue, and the special ed issue. So it's not a theory. Well, it is a theory, but it works in the real world.
Well, so that's exactly where I wanted to transition, because I bet a lot of the people watching this, if they're not too familiar with education, would say, well, conceptually, this is really interesting. You want to move the government from running 100% of schools to having nonprofits run some diverse array of schools from which families can choose. That's a great idea, but how in the world does that happen? That would take a lifetime to happen. Your book actually talks about the concepts that you've been working on for a quarter of a century, but then actually digs in particular, into 3 different cities, Washington, D.C., and Denver, and New Orleans, to show that it didn't take a lifetime, in some of these cases, 10 years, 15, maybe 20 years, to get from nonprofits running 0% of schools to the case of Denver, where it's, a quarter, a third, approaching 50%. Washington, D.C., about 50% now. In New Orleans, as you said, now almost 100%. So talk a little bit about these 3 cities. Why did you spotlight those?
Well, for 2 reasons. I think they're the fastest improving cities in the country.
In terms of student performance? In
terms of student performance, whether you measure it by test scores, graduation rates, college-going rates, attendance rates, many different measures.
Kids are better off.
Kids are dramatically better off. I mean, these cities have basically doubled the effectiveness of their schools in a decade or less. That's a phenomenal achievement. And that's what we need in urban America. So that was part of it, and the fact that they had done it by embracing this new model, which I call a 21st century model, was the other reason that I chose those. And then there was another city that sort of came from the outside and actually overtook Denver. If I'd started later, I would have made Indianapolis the 3rd city.
So say more about Indianapolis, because it's one of these cities that's in the middle of the United States, doesn't get a whole lot of attention, isn't as dramatic as New Orleans, but all of a sudden they have one of the most interesting urban school systems that we have.
They do, and I do spend a half a chapter on Indianapolis. So, so in 2001, when Indiana passed their charter law, a Republican senator had carried that bill and failed 5 times. And so she went and talked with the newly elected Democratic mayor of Indianapolis, Bart Peterson, and said, why don't we give you the power to authorize charters? And you know, here's a mayor who wants to keep the middle class in his city, has a dreadful school system. He loved the idea.
And this is important because he was, at that point, the only mayor in America who had the power to authorize charter schools. This was an innovation.
He supported this bill. It passed because it had Democratic support and Republican support. And he began authorizing and did a great job. His successors, 3 successors, have done a great job. So over a third of the students in Indianapolis are in charters. They're high performing, much higher than the district. So by 2012, reformers in Indianapolis had decided, you know, that model works better than our model. Let's emulate it. They ran some strong candidates for the school board. They got a majority elected. They got the superintendent to retire, hired a new one who believes in school autonomy, then went to the then in the next election they got a stronger majority, went to the legislature and said, give us permission to have some of our district schools be run by nonprofits. They call them innovation network schools. They've now got 16 of them, educating 20% of the kids in the district. And they're using charter principles, operated by nonprofits with boards, with a 5 to 7 year performance agreement with the district. Some of them are schools of choice, some of them are neighborhood schools.
What does neighborhood schools mean?
That if you live close to one of these schools, these are for the K-8, elementary and middle. All the high schools are schools of choice, but you have a right to go to that school. You don't have to. You can go elsewhere, and kids from elsewhere can go to your school, but you're guaranteed to go to your local school. A lot of parents want a local elementary school.
That's right, something close to home.
Yeah, exactly. So the data just came out a couple months ago about their test scores last spring, and these are the fastest improving group of schools in Indianapolis, which is great news. It's happened very quickly because they're only in their 3rd year of this. And they're going to continue. They're going to have 5 more next year and more the year after. And interestingly, you can become an innovation school in diverse ways. Some of them are startups, just like starting up a charter school. Some of them are charters that would like a district building because they all get buildings, and they get a better financial deal than the charters by close to $2,000 per child. So a few charters have become innovation schools. 4 of them so far are district schools, district-operated schools where the teachers voted to leave and become an innovation school because they wanted the autonomy. They were strong schools. The teachers were confident. They're leaving the union behind. They're leaving teacher tenure behind. But these were strong schools, and the teachers were like, we'll be fine. We want the autonomy. We want to be able to run our show completely. So it's a wonderful model. And politically so far, there hasn't been much pushback, unlike with charters, which are in many places so controversial.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching part 1 of our discussion with David Osborne. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like the video or leave us a comment. And if you want to see more, check out part 2.